Thank you, NYCMER Committee and Planning Committee for bringing me here today. I'm very excited to be in conversation with Annie and Gonzalo, two people that I incredibly admire and whose work I look to for inspiration. And, you know, as Kyra kicked us off with this conversation about reaction and response, I think this becomes a really important conversation that we have to have internally as a field right now, particularly in thinking about what we stand for and where our core values are rooted, and who we engage with and whose needs we prioritize within our work today. So as we go through this exploration together, I'm going to invite Annie and Gonzalo to speak and share a little bit about their work, but I really encourage you all, as they're speaking, to think about these questions for ourselves of, what are your personal values within museum education? What drives your work? And more importantly, where do you draw your line in the sand? What are the issues in drawing that line that you must respond to, those that you cannot ignore, and the ones that make you most uncomfortable, the ones that lead you to silence, or even, how should I say, neutrality, right? So consider those questions. We're going to unpack them together, and I have to say I'm not a formal person. I think a lot of you guys know that. So we're going to keep it very conversational today so that we can really think about the practical needs to our work and the philosophy that drives that. So first we're going to hear from Annie Polland, who is the executive director at the American Jewish Historical Society. Previously, Polland served as the senior vice president for programs and interpretation at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, where she was responsible for developing programs and content for over 250 annual visitors. She led the National Endowment for the Humanities' first digital storytelling at museums conference. Polland holds a PhD in history from Columbia University and is the author of several books on Jewish history, including The Emerging Metropolis, New York Jews in the Age of Immigration, which she co-authored with Daniel Sawyer, as well as The Landmark of the Spirit, about the famous Eldridge Street Synagogue. So please join me in welcoming Annie.
Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to be here. Because I do think a lot about space and place, I need to share how I felt about entering Columbia campus this morning. As you heard, I went to school here. I got my PhD here, and I remember arriving. One of the things as I was walking from the subway, I had this visual memory of having arrived here for the first time in 1996, and I had two huge duffel bags with me from Wisconsin, and I was going. My apartment was on 118th Street, but I had to pick up the keys to the apartment on 120th Street or 119th Street. I couldn't remember what. So I got out with my duffel bags, got the key, and kind of had to drag my duffel bags back over to my apartment. So my first day in New York was not exactly one of buoyancy or exhilaration. And Columbia was wonderful because I think, in certain respects, it was wonderful in What it was wonderful for was the amazing content that I learned at Fairweather Hall, where the history department is located. But what it lacked was what is here today, in the sense of the emphasis on education and connecting with people. That was so evident just when you were asked to kind of introduce yourself to someone you didn't know. It was hard to bring everyone back. And that's because I think many of us are here in this room, not just for the content. We're here for the content, but we're also here for the way in which content inspires connections to other people. And so it's so nice to be back and to start thinking a little bit about and talking about reacting and responding together. So the questions that we were asked were, how do we react and respond? How do museums stay relevant to today's visitors in the context of our changing and evolving world? These are excellent questions, of course, and I think that increasingly museums are facing a need to respond to the day's headlines, to issue press releases, and to kind of think about where our voices are. And I think that that's important. But I think even more important is how we move beyond the surface of that comment or press release to ensure that our core work, our day-to-day, is doing the work of reacting and responding and inviting our visitors to do so. So how do we share our knowledge and provide spaces for people to learn and engage and share and teach in a way that builds off of our core content areas and approaches? And how do we do so in such a way that visitors leave thinking about American history, identity, and society? So I'd love to say that I have the answers to all those questions, and that I'll deliver those in the 12 minutes that I have left. But unfortunately, I don't have clear-cut answers. But I think that's the point, that these are the questions we need to be wrestling with, and that each institution needs to be thinking about these questions and what their core values are, so that if they issue a press release, they're also having a staff meeting to kind of talk together with their staff about why they did so, or that even in advance of having to issue a press release or an immediate response, they're thinking about how their responses reflect the institution's missions and values, and how the responses are felt throughout the institution. So in other words, institutions need to carve out room for their staff to be constantly assessing these bigger questions and honing their responses so that there is a sense of shared mission and unity. What I can also do today is share some of my experiences at 2 different institutions. The Tenement Museum, where I worked with some wonderful people who are in this room, tenement educators, and Pedro Garcia. Where's Pedro Garcia? Yes, who is the trainer of all educators in education. So I'm so glad that they're in the room. So these are the wonderful people I worked with on education, exhibitions, and programs, and I worked there for 9 years and just ended in January. And the other institution I'll talk about is one I've only been with for 3 months, not even, the American Jewish Historical Society, where I serve as executive director. Both of the institutions are similar in that they're rooted in the discipline of history, so our content comes from history. Further, the idea of reaction and response, I would argue, is built into the very fabric of each of those organizations. So this is my new place. I chose some pictures from the photo archives thinking about reaction and response. This is members of the American Jewish Congress at a civil rights march. This is Abigail Franks, who wasn't involved in any social movement, but left the letters that she wrote to her son in the early 1700s, one of the best records of women's responses and reactions to what their lives were like that we have in our archives. And then the other is a bus of women going down from the UJA Federation, going down to Washington in support of abortion rights in 1973. You know, obviously what we don't have here are the pictures of those who stayed home and that's something that you always have to think about when you work at an archive. But now onto the Tenement Museum, and I'll get back to the society, but the Tenement Museum, and how many have been there? Okay, let me ask another question. How many have not been to the Tenement Museum? Okay, good. So you find some of the people here, and they'll bring you back there, but I'll tell you a little bit about it. So the Tenement Museum tells the story of ordinary people, immigrants and migrants and their children, who came from all over Europe, Puerto Rico, China, and inhabited 2 tenement buildings on the Lower East Side from 1863 through the 20th century and even beyond. I think one of the things that the Tenement Museum did from the very beginning, it was reacting and responding from its inception. So it was formed as a response to what the founders saw as a dearth of historic houses who took on important social questions and issues. So by making a museum about ordinary people, let alone a museum that talked about immigration, which is by extension is talking about American identity. The founders offered a radical response not just to historic houses, but to traditional museums. Their success in telling immigration stories in vernacular, immersive tenement apartments challenged the book-on-a-wall way in which a grander, more traditional museum might tell the immigration story. They told stories. And every day, the Tenement Museum, and that's Pedro Garcia, and he's here too. So every day, the Tenement Museum introduces hundreds of visitors to a German immigrant woman deserted by her husband who took charity. They introduce visitors to an Italian garment worker and mother who was undocumented. They introduce visitors to an Irish family dealing with prejudice. They introduce visitors to a German family who ran a lager beer saloon, who saw their own American dream end when their patrons pursued their own individual American dreams and moved away, leaving them with fewer and fewer customers. Our educators tell the story of refugees who survived genocide and built new lives. They tell the story of migrants who created a bilingual community center in an abandoned public school. They tell the story of immigrants who sewed all day so their children could do other things. And by that, actually, that statement applies to almost every family that we talk about in the building. Those are stories of how people reacted and responded, sometimes with success, sometimes with failure, and by extension, of course, these are stories of the American society that surrounded the families and how they reacted and responded or failed to react and respond. Their stories, set in particular moments in the American past, provide a springboard for talking about the American present. Though the museum has elaborated upon and honed the methods of storytelling over the years, the idea of react and respond is not new. It's as old as the 19th century stories that are excavated and explored. Perhaps more important, the notion of react and respond is as ancient as the method of community building and connection that happens through storytelling. Thus, in some respects, it's precisely the very old-fashionedness of the tenement, its favoring of educators over audio guides. And in a high-tech world that offers virtual reality, it's deep respect for place and space and immersive learning. That's what makes it most radical, and that's what facilitates reaction and response in a way that is natural and inclusive. What gives you the right to be part of the conversation? It's not your origin, it's the fact that you're on a tour, you're here, you're in this building, and you're part of the storytelling. That's the way that people can become comfortable sharing, that you work together in a group, that you share a story together, you listen to each other's stories. That's the work that I think that is done, that is so radical and so important. These are some of the spaces, these are the primary sources that are shared. And again, so much of the work that happens is rooted in archives. We find things in the archives, bring it to light, and that becomes part of the story that visitors and educators are interpreting together in the historic spaces. This is, for example, the ledger that shows that Natalie Gumpertz received charity. This is really important because sometimes you'll have people visit the museum who will say things like, back then, immigrants didn't take charity, or immigrants didn't need help back then. And you can be like, well, actually, they did. And it's that simple, because you're rooting it in the history. You're showing real stories of real people and the dynamics that they experienced. Now, the most recent exhibit that opened this fall is called Under One Roof, and it's about 3 different families. And this exhibit, I could speak forever about this exhibit, and in particular the people I was able to meet while creating it. These are the stories of people who lived in that building. It was different from telling the stories, obviously, of 19th century residents, because the 19th century residents, no matter how many times you call them, they don't pick up the phone. Whereas these people, not only do they pick up the phone, they will call you and text you and do everything too. So this is Bella Epstein Seligson. We tell the story of her family and her life in the building. She moved in the early 1950s. She was born on the Lower East Side. That's a picture of her and her little sister Blima. Her parents, Coleman and Rivka Epstein, were refugees who survived the concentration camps and came to the Lower East Side to start a new life. We have Jose Valles, who came as a young child, moved to the Lower East Side also in the mid-1950s when he was just a few years old, with his mother, Ramonita, a seamstress who came from Puerto Rico in order to work and to raise her family. And finally, we have Yat Ping Wong, who came with her mother in 1965 from Hong Kong to start a new life as well. And we could have told each of their stories separately, but what was important, we thought, was to tell their stories together, because telling their stories together allowed us to point to a broader context on the Lower East Side, and that was the fact that the Lower East Side had become one of the most diverse, if not the most diverse neighborhood in New York by the 1950s and 1960s, with populations that were coming from the South as part of the second wave of the Great Migration, migration from Puerto Rico, refugees arriving and starting in the 50s, but really picking up in the 1960s after the 1965 immigration law was passed, a Chinese population growing. So we wanted to be able to tell those stories together to talk about the diversity. Also, telling the stories together allowed us to focus on immigration laws and how immigration laws changed over time. One of the things we found in focus groups was that most people weren't aware that immigration laws changed, or that there was a 1924 law or a 1965 law. And because these stories really kind of weave around, or not weave around, they really exemplify the effects of laws passed or not passed with regard to immigration, that allowed us to kind of tell the story of immigration laws within the context of these families. And by telling them together, we could look at change over time. And this is just a recreation of Bella's apartment. So one big apartment that's about 1,000 square feet was subdivided into 3 sections in order to tell the 3 family stories. And one of the things our educators will tell us that you need to remind people of that every time you move through the building, because it's confusing, but powerful. And this is the apartment of Ramanita Saez, I'll get back to her, but this is Mrs. Wong, who comes in 1965 with her daughter Yat Ping, worked in the garment industry. And so one of the things that was important as we created this exhibit was to be able to ensure that Mrs. Wong and her friends and the union organizers she worked with and the bosses she worked with and all the people we were able to interview, they were able to tell their story. So it wasn't just our educators telling the story, they were able to tell their stories through media. And so we embedded audio and video into the sewing machines and the bulletin boards and the payphones so that visitors are spending time discovering the stories in the words of the people who experienced this time period. And here you can see the way in which the videos of the different workers and organizers are projected onto screens, or actually onto fabric that are just simply automated or triggered when you touch the sewing machine. So it's a more kind of immersive way for people to learn this material. But in some ways, after finishing the exhibit and seeing people go through it, the moment that I feel like brought everything alive was this plastic couch. You guys, I'm looking out, and many of you look quite young, but did any one of you have a family member who ever had plastic on their couch? Okay, good. Okay, so I think that there's something about plastic-covered seats are the common denominator of American family life and identity. And there's a way in which the plastic couch becomes this amazing symbol of pluralism. And so Ramanita put the plastic on her couch because she was a very sociable person. She worked all week, but she loved cooking and she loved having people over. She was not the kind of person who could afford to get a new couch every year. So she put the plastic on her couch, and that facilitated her sociable nature and having people come over. But one of the things we're able to do, and we allow people to sit down and hear the kind of the sound of the plastic and the kind of the air coming out as people sit, which is an amazing effect. It triggers all sorts of memories. So our visitors who are coming from all over the country and from all different kind of immigrant ethnic backgrounds are able to share stories. And we're able to ask them things like, how many of you have a Ramanita in your life, right? And so we get the stories of a Jamaican aunt who helped people come to Miami, or all sorts of things. So that this couch, in a way, is a way that we're opening up space for visitors to share how their own family members have reacted and responded to American histories, and giving people the opportunity to hear stories they might not have been able to hear. And then to build on that, we created a website where people could also share their stories. No matter, the Tenement Museum kind of realized it couldn't buy every building in New York and add more and more apartments, although I'm sure if you want to write them a check to do that, they will take that check and do that. But in order to capture as many stories as possible, this website allows people to kind of upload a picture of an object that in some way tells their migration or immigration stories. And so I think now it has over 4,000 of these stories from all over the country, and we're working with museums to do this collection and facilitate this storytelling. And one of the things that motivated that project was this quote from President Barack Obama. He says, "The thing that brings people together to have the courage to take action on behalf of their lives is not just that they care about the same issue, it's that they have shared stories." And if you want to be able to bring people together, you have to listen to people's stories, and you can find out what's sacred in other people's stories. Then you'll be able to forge a relationship that lasts. And I think that this is a really important work in all the museum work that we do, reacting and responding to the stories of our visitors. Okay, so how do you go from being at the Tenement Museum, this amazing immersive environment, to an archive? It doesn't look as sexy, and I know that there was just a New Yorker article about dating different museums, and that the Tenement Museum was not as sexy as the Whitney, but it was like kind of okay. Like this didn't even merit inclusion. But for me, as I look at these boxes, I know what's inside these boxes, and these boxes are stories that just blow my mind every time I pull something out and look at it. The American Jewish Historical Society was formed in 1892. It was formed as a reaction to nativism that was growing at the time. And so the reaction of this group of Jews, what do we do when there's nativism? Let's form a historical society. So up to that point, historical societies had only been kind of regional historical societies, or there had started to be things like the Daughters of American Revolution, which were founded basically at a point where they wanted to say, we go back further. So they were kind of exclusionary historical societies. AJHS was the first ethnic cultural historical society in America up to that point, but soon the Irish would follow and other groups would follow as well. When I got there, one of the things I did was pull out the transcript of the first meeting. So as historians, as people rooted in the discipline of history, they realized it was important to keep a record of that meeting. And they were fighting about this and that, but what was really important was that they wanted to establish this in the discipline of history. And that was important that it wasn't just Jewish people involved, there would be Christian historians there as well. All of this, that, and the other thing. But suddenly on page 15 of the transcript, and this is a picture, this is the invitation to go to the meeting. These are some of the people in the early years. There were neat kind of newspaper sketches. I was so excited to find the woman that was there. Unfortunately, she was just reading a paper from her father, but anyways. This is the minute. And this quote, it was kind of amazing. It was by Cyrus Adler, who was a 28-year-old who worked at the Smithsonian. But he writes, I think that if we can show clearly to the people of the United States what the Jews of this country have done, what they have contributed as citizens of this republic, we shall accomplish a great work. We shall be able to remove a great deal of prejudice that still remains in the people of this country against the Jews. It was something that no one had said up to that point in the meeting. But it was something that was clearly in the background, right? That this historical society was founded in part due to fear and anxiety, but also equally in part to this faith they had in this country, and also a faith they had in the idea of knowledge and history. If only people knew, if only we could teach them, prejudice, bigotry, this stuff would disappear. Over 100 years later, clearly they weren't successful. Prejudice, discrimination, bigotry still exists in this country. But what they started to do as well is collect stories of all different organizations that were part of America. And there's so much to talk about, but people who were in the Revolutionary War, a gay bullfighter who lived in Brooklyn, a woman who became a lawyer in the 1920s who helped refugees. Each story is very much about the interaction with the broader world. American Jews, neither as individuals nor as collectives, lived in a vacuum, so that the work they're doing as a minority group shoring up identity or serving in the military or writing newspapers or fighting anti-Semitism or organizing women is relevant not only for what it shows American society at the time, but because some of the methods they use in communal organizations are still relevant for Jews today as well as other minority groups. The most exciting thing for me that's in this collection is the collection of Emma Lazarus, who was a fourth-generation American Jewish woman who lived in New York, born in 1849, and she's known now for a little poem she scribbled in 1883 that would wind up on the base of the Statue of Liberty, the new Colossus. She was someone, again, as you can tell, who lived through the Civil War, Reconstruction. She witnessed a rise in nativism that was connected with immigration. She was alive for the Chinese Exclusion Act. In short, in the 1880s, when she was living and coming into her own as a poet, American identity was tumultuous. She experienced social anti-Semitism. She saw how increased immigration spiked nativism. She absorbed these changes, and when asked to write a poem for the statue, turned the statue itself into a symbol of immigration and of America's very identity as rooted in a welcoming of refugees. She Europe, she wrote, could keep its storied pomp. America, by contrast, should take the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, because their very yearning, that very yearning, made the country better. So today we have people in this country who also have storied pomp about this own country, like legends about what America was and that we have to go back to. So it seems to me that this poem and this spirit that she brings, and the fact that she herself lived in a time in which American identity was contested and debated, it makes sense for us to pull this out again and to see how can this become a base for us today to explore what American identity is. How can we delve deep into the conflicts and tensions and the diverse voices of the 1880s as a prompt to think about the diverse voices that are thinking about American identity today. So what I would propose to do, what I hope to do, is create a contest. If you could write a poem or create spoken word for the Statue of Liberty today, what would you say? And to kind of bolster that in curriculum, websites, exhibitions that allow us to kind of delve into the different content, both of the 1880s and today, and then give people a voice. I would hope that this contest awakens interest in the multiple voices of Americans past, to encourage the civil debate of Americans present, and to shape a dynamic, creative, and inclusive American future. To invite as many people as possible into the opportunity of writing a new poem, thinking about what American identity is, and inviting them to react and respond. So this, I'm hoping, is a way to draw on content and approach to invite people into the project of studying, creating, and shaping an inclusive and expansive American identity. We react and respond first by understanding that Americans in the past have done this, that reacting and responding is part of being here. We react and respond by using the content and the stories in our collections and experimenting with ways to engage and involve more and more people. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. We'll now hear from Gonzalo Casals. Gonzalo is the director of the Leslie-Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art. His experience ranges from innovative cultural programming and authentic community engagement strategies to progressive cultural policy. His tenure at Friends of the High Line and El Museo del Barrio focused on cultural production as a vehicle to foster empowerment, social capital, and civic participation. Gonzalo was part of the team that led New York City's first comprehensive cultural plan and a commissioner on the Mayoral Advisory Commission on City Art, Monuments, and Markers. He teaches arts administration and cultural policy at CUNY. Thank you, Gonzalo.
Thank you, Annie, for your presentation. One of my saddest days at working in El Barrio in East Harlem was when there was a little shop by the Diaz family who would do plastic covers for sofas, and they closed because they got displaced by a 7-Eleven. And that's when I knew that it was at the end of an era. And thank you, Keonna, for your presentation. I feel like I should be the one asking questions and Keonna speaking. I have a tremendous admiration for all the work you're doing, not only at the museum, but in your own practice. So I'm going to try to keep it really short so we can move into the conversation and have fun. The one thing that you failed to mention, Keonna, in my presentation is that I was NYCMER's first intern in its history. And I had a little bit of an emotional moment when I was coming in and I was seeing the banner coming up of NYCMER. I was like, oh my God, you know. And so congratulations, Kyra, Kenneth, and everybody. You guys took the organization in a different level, a whole new level, and came a long way. So I'm very proud of all of you. And I'm proud to be here. There's amazing people in the room. Sharon Baskey, who is the one to blame by why I'm a museum educator. Amazing colleagues like Catherine Potts, many of people I work with, and I'm not going to name them because I love all my children the same, and also a lot of students. And I'm saying this not only just to shout out to all of them and to all of you, but I was thinking when I was asked to do this, oh my God, I need to mention somebody. Vanessa, smiling in the back. 2 strikes. Student and colleague. When I was invited to this, I was just thinking really hard, which is something, is sort of a strategy I force myself to do every time an opportunity presents to me, is think about for a minute the amount of power that is in this room. We have probably representatives of every museum in New York City, and if not every museum, almost all of them. We have the veterans like me, which carry a lot of experience, but we also have a lot of emerging, passionate, enthusiastic energy in the room. So, and then think about the power dynamics now in the room, right? You all sitting, listen to me quietly and paying a lot of attention. So what do I do with that? And I have some notes on my phone just to make sure to keep me on track. What do I do with that? And I could just talk to you about the amazing work we're doing at the museum. I'm not going to do that. I don't think that's interesting. And if any of you are interested, you can go to the website. My email is there. You send me an email, and we can go for coffee. And I rather wanted to talk a little bit about what should we all be doing as a group, what I think we should be doing as a group in times like these. And I think, I want to problematize a little bit the idea of reacting and responding and really start thinking about proactively acting, right? The social injustices, very much as you mentioned in your presentation, that we're seeing today, they're not new. They're not necessarily because of the current administration. Probably the current administration is making it worse. But we have seen social injustice in our country for decades, if not centuries. And probably they're going to continue once this current administration leaves. So the question to all of us is, how do we create the change that we want to see in society? And I think, as much as we need to think about our organizations, we need to start thinking about each and every one of us. And really, I want to put, 3 or 4 ideas on the table for us to discuss as a group that I think are important to consider. The first one starts with the idea of privilege, right? We all have disadvantages. We all have our own problems. But we need to start focusing also on the privilege that each of everyone holds. I'm an immigrant, I'm a queer person, I'm Latino. I could just tell you all the problems, all the disadvantages that I face in every day. But at the same time, I'm a white passing Latino. You can see my skin. I am overly educated, like probably many of us in the room. I go home to a family. I just have all my needs taken care. And that gives me power, and that gives me access to opportunities. And having access to a network like this is also extremely powerful. So, what each and every one of us are going to decide, once we acknowledge, again, what access, our privilege, and what access we have to power, what we're going to do with that. And let me tell you, it wasn't easy for me the first, times in which somebody called on my privilege. I felt angry. How can you tell me that? Since I came to this country, I worked my ass off, and you're telling me that I have privilege. I felt hurt that I wasn't being recognized. But then very quickly, that feeling moved to a shame. How I could not see that others don't have the same opportunities I have. And rather than just be sort of commiserating on what I don't have, is what I'm going to do with all the power I have. And only when you acknowledge your own privilege, then you can help the organization that you work for start acknowledging the privilege. And I can talk more during our conversation how we did that with my team at the Highline. I did mention also the idea of power dynamics. In every relationship that we have in our lives, there's a dynamic of power. Probably the easiest way to point that out is think of your Thanksgiving dinner, if you celebrate Thanksgiving. Think of your interactions with your partners or your significant others. And then think of dynamics of powers that you have at work with your colleagues, but also the dynamics of powers that you have with your visitors, with the students that you deal with, and how you can try to balance those. And probably the first step to balance the power dynamics is to acknowledge them, right? Just to come in a situation, I said, I have the power, let's figure out how we can share this together. And then there's two other ideas that I think, I'm so glad that there's a teacher there. What's your name? Blue hair. Rachel. Can you stand up and show everybody your t-shirt? Museums are not neutral, right? And that idea, that illusion of neutrality in which the status quo is the right thing, and then those that want to change it were the political ones, is BS, right? Every minute, in our jobs, in our lives, we're constantly making decisions. Those decisions are based on conscious and unconscious bias. Those decisions are based on our values. Those decisions are based on who we know and who we are. And we have to be extremely careful to understand that those decisions have an impact. So when at the very core of the work that we all do is interpretation. And interpretation is about making decisions based on values. So every day, you are either reinforcing the status quo or you're just changing it. So many of you might think, well, Gonzalo, it's easier for you to say that because you're a museum director now. Yes, it's much easier. But, and again, it's hard and it's messy and it's difficult to come into an organization and start making change from within. We can talk more about that. And my colleagues at the Highland can tell you all about that. But what I want to just go back to the idea at the beginning is we have this, right? There's a tremendous amount of social capital in this room. And I want to challenge all of you to, for a minute, stop talking about programs, stop talking about content, and start talking a little bit, what is it a group like this, like NYCMER, can do to really change our practice and really prioritize what we think is important to build the society that we want to have. Thank you.
Thank you both for sharing some really thoughtful questions and also a bit of your work. I think you've given us a lot to consider, especially when it comes to this conversation around responsiveness and also how really the underlying question is, how closely connected are we on an ongoing basis with the communities that we engage with, and also the communities that we seek to engage with, but don't necessarily always invite to the table. I actually want to start there, because a lot of times, in my work outside of the Brooklyn Museum, I find myself in conversations with staff who are saying, I got to get it together because we got this exhibition coming up, and no one knows how to teach from works by Indian artists. Or we don't know how to talk about the sexuality of this artist. We got to get prepared. And there's an old saying of, well, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. You guys heard of that, right? So I want to put this back to you guys, especially now as directors. How then do we start to create a culture within our institutions where we are always in constant discourse with these issues? It's not a surprise, but we're ready because we're there in allyship as accomplices with communities that have particular needs.
I could say. So, I mean, it all depends, which organization you're talking about and the context. I can give you two examples. One is when I came in, I was at the Highline for 4 years. And when I came in, although I was just talking to a colleague of mine saying, when I was interviewing, I was like, are you sure you know who you're hiring, right? What the work I do. And well, it was really clear that they were hiring somebody like me because they really wanted to connect with local communities, specifically the 5,000 people living in public housing a minute away from the Highline. What it was really very quickly, myself and the team, we realized that there was a conflict between one person or one department or one group of people trying to do engagement, and then the rest of the organization. And in that case was that the Highland, by Friends of the Highland, was still being seen, and this beautiful object that we created, that we need to keep it, extremely beautiful. Actually, the strategic plan was saying keep it extraordinary, despite that thousands of people are going to come in and mess it up, right? So it wasn't even about, like we're serving people and we're not serving everybody. We're not about people. And just really sort of like have that shift in the organizational culture in which we are out of service of different communities, different people, and then just look out, what that service looks like from different communities and different needs. It's a lot of work, but I feel like, many of my colleagues and we feel like, the biggest victory in that sort of tenure. And then in a similar way, just to put in the context of museums, sometimes the Highland is a hybrid. I came into Leslie-Lohman Museum where a lot of the emphasis was put of what's hung on the walls, which is very important, but there was no emphasis in what you do with that. And at the very beginning of my career, I landed in Jackson Heights, Queens, which I still live, and that still to this day is the second largest concentration of gay men in the city. Back then, this is years ago, no cell phones, no social media. A lot of the gay men in the neighborhood, the mostly recently arrived immigrants, would not go to the city. They would, the only place to connect with other gay men was the bar scene, which, not to vilify it, but sometimes it's not the safest place to meet people. And I created a film series that would meet every once a month, and we just put a lot of emphasis in the quality of the film, but we put as much emphasis on building a community around that experience. And I think that starts to sort of answer that question of like, how do you stay ready? Well, you just change completely your mind, and it's not about the content, it's not about how you deliver the content, it's how is that relevant to the people that you want to serve.
I was just going to say that in that you brought Jackson Heights, where you lived. I think one of the kind of aha moments for me was I live in Kensington in Brooklyn, which is a very diverse neighborhood, and my daughter went to a very diverse school, and we live in a building that is South Asian and Chinese and Caribbean and African American and Soviet Jewish, like everything. And I remember, coming home and thinking, like, this is a little weird that I work at the Tenement Museum, and a lot of the people who come on tours, aside from school children, but a lot of the people who come on tours are not necessarily people who are representing the diversity of New York, as I was experiencing in my building. And so the Your Story, Our Story, in part came from the kind of the website where we're gathering objects from people, came from a kind of close partnership with PS 130 down the block, where we brought the parents then to the museum to see the work the students had done. And one of the most, I think, the nicest comment was someone said, I always knew how diverse the school was, but now I understand what diversity is, because people were actually sharing their stories. So it's like those moments when you're able to kind of take something from your own life and what you're seeing and try to bring that to the institution. But I think one of the best things to do is always be talking to staff who are on the ground and how you coordinate that, moving to a new place. So I had the fortune to be at the Tenement Museum for so long and to be able to work with hundreds of brilliant educators who are, and many are here, hi Berto, who did wonderful work in that space, and to be able to talk to them and say, what's going on, what's missing, what do we need to do? That's where I learned the most, talking to the staff that were on the ground. But then how do you translate that in a quick way while also dealing with all the people who are showing up every day? And now being in a new institution, the first thing, Gonzalo and I were talking, and I said, I went my first day and I said, what day are the staff meetings? And everyone looked at me like I was crazy. They're like, what? We don't have staff meetings. And so let's start staff meetings. And so that becomes this process with staff of looking at what is our mission and do we need to change our mission and all of that. But it's all a lot of processes.
And one of the more aha moments I have in my career was the summer of 2010. It was at El Museo del Barrio. We just reopened a year before, so we had raised a lot of money for like a couple of years, so that sort of 2008, 2009 crisis didn't hit us until that summer. I was sitting on my desk as Director of Education and Programs with a long list of people that I have to call partners to tell them we cannot fund the program we're doing together anymore. And what I was met, the answers that I was met over and over again were amazing. We're saying, you know, like to me it was like, we cannot do the program anymore, see you. And what I would just listen is, well, maybe you cannot do this, but can we still use your classroom? Maybe you cannot do this, but can you still take our youth as interns? Maybe, you know, like it was all about looking for alternative ways of continuing the relationship. And that's the day I realized we're not in the business of putting programs together, we're in the business of building relationships. Right? And so when we came to the Highline and the emphasis was we want people to come to us, I was like, why don't we just take a minute and we put a lot of energy on becoming stakeholders of our neighborhood, right? And go out there, meet people, see what we can do for the neighborhood before we just try to bring people and say, you know, this is how amazing we are and that's why you should be our friend.
Absolutely. I think both of you bring up a couple of points that are really salient. One being this conversation around what does it mean to be relevant and for whom? Mm-hmm. Sometimes our questions, I think our conversations around like, oh, we need to be relevant. The museums will go out of style are so self-serving that it actually replicates the trauma that you know, some of us are actually trying to reduce in terms of being relevant to the needs of marginalized communities and audiences that may come through our doors. And so I find sometimes within organizations, that's a real disconnect, particularly between educators and maybe other departments who aren't having all that front-facing experience. You know, and so the relevance becomes about optics, not about relationship. And the second thing that you guys both hinted at, and this sense of trust that underlies shared authority within your staff. And I'm wondering about that because I think it's so important to have a trust in staff and to have that time to share power with staff members who, especially those who are really intimately connected to audience or to, I would say, the non-audience, right? The folks that we don't engage with that might be in the building across the street that we never see walk through the door, don't even know we're there. But I also see sometimes that crossing the line of a savior syndrome. You know, you guys heard of that before? Savior syndrome, okay. So this idea of like, if we don't give it to you, where are you gonna get it from? Who's going to provide it for you? And I wonder, too, as you navigate this conversation around power, around getting people to tell their stories, to feel like they can trust the museum to come in and share and engage, how do you reduce savior syndrome, particularly for educators? How can we individually do that? And then how do we reduce it so that we can look at the assets that communities have? And I don't like that word community, sorry, but I'll use it today, the assets from a grander institutional perspective, you know?
So.
I know I gave you a big question.
No, yeah. There is the, before my predecessor, Dania Sherman at the Highline, she was amazing and she planted a lot of the seeds of the work that we had done. And what she had done is just an amazing, you know, like over 1,000 people survey in public housing, just to really understand what do you need and how do you see the Highline. The interesting thing is that whenever they were asking what do you need from us, they keep saying jobs, right? Which not to dismiss the need, but you know, like what I was saying is when somebody rich comes to a person, you know, less privileged and you ask them, you know, what do you need? Probably it's gonna be, the answer is gonna be money or work, right? So to me it was really challenging to, while we wanted to come into the neighborhood and offer our resources, at the same time, it was important that the solution wasn't writing a check, which Friends of the Highline could have done, right? And both for the organization to understand that it's not as easy as writing a check or just putting more resources in programs, but also for our potential partners to see us as more than just money. And that it just, again, is very specific of almost every person that you engage with, but understanding a little bit, what are the projects that are happening in the neighborhood and how you find your role. And I think one of the most successful examples of that was we had a teen program in which we were hiring the teens to work on the park and just to do different things. And we transitioned that to programming and to do other things, but at the same time get them really involved in the participatory budgeting process in the neighborhood, right? So in that way, we were able to accomplish many things. One is, for a teenager, no matter who you are, how alienating is to sort of figure out your role in your neighborhood. And two is for the neighborhood to see that our expertise in navigating the city, in ideas of urban planning, ideas of capital projects can be put to use in the neighborhood. And just making sure the organization understood that we needed enough time, but enough time we needed 3 years in order to see sort of the results of that, building that relationship and taking that role in the neighborhood.
In terms of the savior thing, I think one of the things that helps, for example, at an institution like the Tenement Museum is that I think the tours raise more questions, and so that if you're trying to raise questions and you can't look like a savior because you're out there saying I don't know the answer, and let's explore this material together to get there. So that the content and always going back to the content kind of helps move away from the idea that one person on a tour is going to save something. I think sometimes educators, though, would have a sense that if they took out a tour out and someone didn't cry on the tour or they didn't get applause at the end of the tour, that in some ways they had failed. And I think one of the things that we tried to talk about it's not about that. It's not about tying things up with a bow. It's about having people walk away with a lot of questions. And when we at a society or an archive, when we're opening up our space for people to explore, we're just providing the content to them. Clearly, it's content that's been interpreted, it's been chosen, it's been processed in a way, but that to see yourself as someone offering content and space as opposed to someone to coming up with answers is important at chipping away at the savior thing.
And then there's a humbling moment that I love and I secretly enjoy. There was a whole process at the Highland to start hiring more diversity. They were hiring for a position in a different department. I was sort of helping that person because I knew that he was a Latino. And when they finally offered the job to this person had also another job opportunity somewhere else. And he was trying to negotiate. And people were just, they couldn't understand why, like we came to you, we're just coming to give you a job, you're a brown person. There's nothing better for you to work at the Highland, and all of a sudden you're just negotiating with us. And I thought that it was, I'm just jokingly, but that's a very good example of how we come in and we assume that we're doing the best that you could do for somebody, and that somebody says, well, probably you're not an option for me.
No, I think that's a really important point. I mean, I've been having conversations with people who are like, I'm looking for diverse candidates, which we know is code for people of color or queer people or gender non-conforming people. And they say, I've done everything. How come they're not coming? And I'm like, well, what is your reputation like in that in those communities? What makes you think that Black people want to work for you? Because, I mean, let's keep it real. The reality is this is not a glorious job. It's wonderful. I love it. I don't want to be anywhere else. But if I'm going to deal with racism or if I'm going to deal with sexism or your homophobia, then should I just deal with that in a corporate space where I can make $50,000 more? And I choose not to, but there are other people who have chosen to. Right? So, I think that's become, it raises this question for me too, and I'm putting you on the hot seat because I'm not a director yet. But like as
yet is the operative word.
As leaders of institution, how do we check ourselves in that way to make sure that all of this responsiveness is not just external, but it's internal as well, right? Because when your staff members leave through those doors at night, when all of us go home, we still are part of a lot of the communities that our organizations seek to engage, but sometimes we're not being heard, there's no reaction or there's no response when we're working day to day in these spaces. So, some of it is like, keeping your house clean. So when you go outside, everyone else can also see like, oh, okay, they're walking the walk, they're talking the talk. How do you navigate that as directors, and what can you say to other leaders who are in the field who are not necessarily facilitating that alignment?
I think in part, and again, because I don't think there is a clear-cut answer, and so much depends on the context, but ensuring that your staff at all levels feels empowered and comfortable speaking and sharing and being part of forging the institution, so that they're not just asked to do their job, but they feel bound up in the mission. And if they can co-create a mission and core values, and that you're returning to that often, that is something that if you do that in a right way, then those voices come forward.
There are two things, right? One is diversity, or however you want to call it, as an ends or as a means, right? And I feel like most of the time, most people speak of diversity as an ends, right? I need to have a certain amount of people of color in my staff. When, ideally it's a means of something. What's that something is that once you have enough different perspectives in the organization, change is going to come. Right, and then the brave people that decided to join an organization that probably organizational culture is not that ideal, when there's enough of that, and I'm not saying we should put all that on the people of color, right? The change has to come from within, and there's enough critical mass in order for that change to happen. Now, to answer, from the perspective of an executive director, the advice I could give to all of you is just to keep pushing and keep harping, right? Unfortunately, and I'm not saying it should be ideal, but every day I'm faced with so many decisions, and I worry about so many other things that even for somebody like myself that has been thinking, I need to learn a lot about this, but I've been thinking about this for decades, it's hard to have enough time to just do the right thing, and just doing what I did hopefully to my bosses, and there was a lot of moments of tensions there, just constantly putting it on the table and remind us that that's a priority. If your bosses are cool, it would be something very helpful.
Yeah, and I would just add, what is the mission of your institution, and how is the mission of your institution, how do you show that it's important to have all of these voices at the table? So at the end of the day, it's not just, I have a table, and that table represents different groups, but it's where are we all going, and why are we all here, regardless, or not, both regardless and precisely because of what we look like and who we look like. Yeah.
Absolutely. I do want to go back to this conversation about react and response, because sometimes I think we look at them as like dichotomous, like response is almost better in some ways than reacting, right? But, particularly, you spoke about this too, Gonzalo, at this moment, we're not seeing anything new socially or culturally. It's just being televised, or it's being like shared in social media. So the frequency of our awareness is just more acute. But with that, there is a reality of the immediacy of addressing issues, right? And so in some ways, and I can think about, just being a woman of color, how if I'm feeling, or if I experience some kind of discrimination and there's no reaction, it almost feels like it happened in silo, right? So there's the immediacy that of need of like, wait, is someone there? Does someone see me? And so, I don't think those things I don't think reacting is necessarily bad. But mutually exclusive. Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive. And I wonder, are there moments that you've seen like within our field now that you're like, we have to react? We don't have time to respond. Or maybe we do need to respond, but we also need an immediate reaction as well. I don't know, I could be completely off base, but I wonder, do you feel that, do you sense that as well? Mm-hmm.
You're absolutely right.
I mean, one thing to the point too of is that things haven't totally changed, although sometimes there's this desire to make it seem like they were dramatic. So when Trump was elected, an AP reporter called people at the Tenement Museum and was like, what happened now that Trump is in office? And he really only then took quotes from people that showed that there was a dramatic change and hostility, I think was the word that was used, that there was a hostile atmosphere now from our visitors. And it was really exaggerated, so much so that when this article came out, I got much more response to that article than an amazing article about our content that had been in the New York Times that had come out a month before, because people were like, ooh, let's look at that. And then it bred all these other articles about it surrounding it. But the reality, at least the reality as I understood it, is that things that people were saying weren't that different than what they had been saying before. It was just that now there was a spotlight on it. And I think that one of the things at the Tenement Museum that would happen, and my guess is still happens, is that there would be times that someone, an Asian person, was leading a Jewish tour or an Irish tour, and someone would say something to the effect of, oh, why are you leading this tour, right? That was something a visitor said, but we as an institution needed to take better responsibility for that and training for that and kind of how to deal with that. But it's like being open, being aware, listening, and reacting as soon as you can, but making sure you're being open enough to ensure that you're hearing about things that are happening as well.
I think it has to do with long-term and short-term goals, if you will, right? I'm going to tell a very short story. I was involved with the mayor's sort of commission to decide which monuments go up or stay down. Super long story short, you know, like it wasn't enough time. But anyways, as part of that, the monument of Marian Sims, who was a gynecologist that was extremely abusive to women of color, and then I went to learn that he wasn't even a good gynecologist, but that's a different story. It was one of the monuments that was up there, right? And a lot of people that was pushing back on this were saying, well, people are hysterical, you know, now they see it in social media, now everybody's talking about it, and they want to bring it down. And to me, it was really important to, in the craziness of the politics of that commission, to make sure that people knew that for 10 years, Puerto Rican and African-American women in East Harlem had been organized to take down that monument, right? And that now the window of opportunity of 10 years of like really, you know, just be talking about that. It was the moment, you know, that just do action. And that was my opportunity to sort of make sure that that would happen. And to me is short term, yes, monuments are coming down, let's react to this one, but just not take for granted the long-term work that happened in organizing around that. So while I'm extremely excited that a lot of people are just sort of waking up because of what's happening, you know, with our country in the last 2 years, I just want to make sure that we go beyond just putting on a pussy hat and going to a manifestation and a rally, or just to share on social media an article of a friend that, you know, is really cool, and really understand, yes, let's do all that. Let's learn, you know, who are our elected officials and who needs to be in power. But at the same time, what do we do with the power that we have as museum educators in the organizations that we work? And long term, what are the narratives that we need to create so the next generation doesn't make the mistakes that we're making now?
Absolutely.
One of the questions I have too, though, is thinking about, and I don't have an answer, but museums aren't neutral. I think we all agree with that, even if we're not wearing the T-shirt over there. But even if museums aren't neutral, how do we ensure that we're getting people in the door? Like, we're not closing the door to people before they come to the museum. In other words, I think, you know, so an educator had been upset because someone had come on a tour wearing a Trump T-shirt one day. And I said, you know, how did you lead the tour? She said, well, I gave the tour just as I would, even if the T-shirt wasn't there. I said, you did the right thing, because we can't put something on our visitorship that says only people who voted for Bernie Sanders can come to the Tenement Museum. And if we did that, we would fail, because the lessons that the Tenement Museum has are really relevant precisely for people who might have voted for Trump, right? So how do we ensure that we're kind of at the same time having stances, living up to the core values that our institution espouses, but making sure that the audience that we're letting in is as diverse as it is, and diverse meaning diverse with regard to political beliefs as well?
Is Camilo Godoy here? too bad. He's one of my educators. He's amazing.
He's one of my educators too.
Yes.
Oh my gosh,
There
you can't
go.
steal him.
Now I know what he's so great.
I want him to be
Yeah.
one of my educators.
Yes. So Camilo started teaching at the museum at Leslie-Lohman shortly, a couple months ago, and a group of students from the Queer Center of Staten Island comes in. They look at a beautiful sculpture by a transgender artist called Casals, who the work addresses the 20% raise on violence against transgender people in the last 2 years. They're doing the typical thing, inquiry-based, what do you see, you know, blah, 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 blah. And a transgender person of color says, you know, what this work makes me think is that Black trans lives matter. Immediately after that statement, from another person from the group says, well, you know, I think all lives matter, right? What do you do? How do you train your educators to react to that, right? And I'm amazed at Camilo, probably because he works with you. He took the opportunity to talk about systemic oppression, to talk about intersectionality, to talk about, you know, all these issues without shying away from conflict, right? There's an amazing book by Lohman that everybody should read that is Conflict is Not Abuse, right? And I think like we're trying to, because we're looking at the people that walk into the doors as clients, as visitors, where sometimes we're walking on eggshells trying to make everybody happy, while we should be trained, and please don't go tomorrow and start doing this without training, right? But just train to manage these conversations.
Absolutely. Oh, I was going to say, I think that brings up some real issues that a lot of us wrestle with about our individual views and values versus our institutional voices, you know, and, you know, the reality is the museums are us, right? A collection of people, obviously boards as well, but they're not brick and mortar. And so sometimes it's very easy to be like, well, the museum stance is this. Well, who actually in the museum stance is this? And at what point, you know, I started out with asking us all to think about our lines in the stand, because at some point we have to figure out, you know, what are the things that we're going to align ourselves with? What perspectives or voices are we going to align ourselves with? And when are we going to become folks who say, you know what, this isn't worth it. This actually is not what I got in here for. And I'm either creating new mythologies, rewriting history, you know, really, or, you know, allowing the status quo, the oppressive status quo, to persist. You know, and it brings up another word that we haven't talked about here, is healing, right? Because all of what you're speaking of, whether it's at the Jewish Heritage Museum and thinking about nationalism, or whether it's at Leslie-Lohman and thinking about articulating one's humanity, is generational trauma. You know, we have a real opportunity as educators to help people heal, not in 75 minutes, but to start to like heal a little bit of that trauma in some way, or at least unpack it, you know. So actually, I want us to open it up for a bigger conversation, because I'm sure you guys have a lot to talk about, right? Right? So, okay. So we have 2 mics, one down here. If folks want to come up and line up to ask some questions, we want to open it up to the crowd. Don't be shy.
And I like confrontation. So
Yes, we all like a good debate here. We talked about that before we started. Oh, great. Tell us your name and
Cheney McKnight, I'm Not Your Mama's History. I am collecting data of African American costume interpreters at living history sites and historical sites. I worked for quite some time at a historical site with costume interpretation. What I'm finding is high rates of depression, PTSD, and anxiety. But in my interviews, I'm finding that even people who aren't in costume are experiencing trauma through interactions with guests. What are your experiences among your educators, interpreters, and what are you doing to help them, to aid them, to support them? Thank you.
thank you. Great question.
No problem.
It's an excellent question. I think it's a question that has, I think at least in my experience or my understanding of my experience, it's been in the last maybe 2 or 3 years where educators have been more open about coming forward and talking about these issues. So I think partly it's creating space, trying to validate. I think also bringing in consultants who have specific knowledge and can add more to those conversations, and creating the spaces for that. And again, making sure that people feel comfortable enough to come forward with those questions. It's a really tough thing because the institution can have core values, and then visitors who come to that institution might not share those values. So how are different ways you're communicating to your visitors what these core values are? We've done things like at the Tenement Museum, we started kind of even having a word that, walkie-talkies, all educators have a walkie-talkie that they can use to communicate with people, how someone could come in just to even join a tour. So if they start to sense discomfort from someone, they could just simply have someone join a tour. I think there were also a way that you can actually have someone just come in and replace, and that's happened. And it took a while because even after we put that policy forward and talked about it and even had people practice doing like the code word on the walkie-talkie, a lot of times people were still hesitant to do it because they felt as performers they had to move forward with whatever it is they were doing. And then there was a kind of a breakthrough when someone actually did do it and was able to go back to the break room and say, I did that, and that was helpful. But it's ongoing. That's not the solution. It's kind of just keep with that. It's an excellent question.
We, when I first started at Museo del Barrio, we had an exhibition about the thousands of people that was disappeared by military governments in different countries, in mostly South America and Latin America. Most of our educators were coming from those countries, and while we were paying a lot of attention to the visitors and just understanding that the visitors might feel moved and they need some support, we were not thinking of the educators. And we had an instance in which when an educator was engaging in a piece, somebody says, well, you Latinos are always trying to blame somebody else for your problems. And that's sort of what triggered, like the alarm, for us. And what we found was really important is that while the educators were telling the stories that the artists were bringing for the work, we had not allowed them to tell their own stories. And just building that space, on a weekly basis, every other week, for the educators and the staff to just start talking about the trauma was extremely helpful. And then at Leslie-Lohman, which blows my mind, when I came in, I realized that a lot of the older, not a lot, but there was a community of older men that were just behaving inappropriately to our staff. And just until that moment, nobody had told them, like the minute you feel that you're in a situation like this, feel free to drop everything you're doing, no matter what you're doing, and just come and look for help, right? And just that goes a long way, right?
I was just going to say, like, in this work, so many of us put our whole self forward, so that can feel particularly hard when your values are, like, crushed right in front of you, and you're trying, and you feel it's like your job to get someone to not think that way, and then so it's what makes you so good at what you do that can also make you so sensitive to what is happening.
But also what's important for us most in that exhibition about the disappear is to remind the educators that, it was about facilitating conversations, not convincing people, right? Sort of like, just remove that pressure from.
Yeah. Thank you. I will add one thing too. For me, it's starting to figure out my own trauma and how I'm showing up with that in the workplace, and also some vulnerability, modeling that, so that others can feel like they can model it. Hopefully I'm doing a good job of it, I don't know. And then having your community outside of work. So finding your people and meeting with them regularly, because, there's the work I do in Brooklyn Museum, then there's the work I do with helping departments create their own anti-racist pedagogy. And it's hard to sit there when people say racist things about Black people, and you're like, okay, let me help you work through that. I have to really be cognizant of my own time and space and healing and like what my purpose is in that moment, and also what I can't do. And sometimes you have to say, like right now at this time and place, I can't show up in this way for this reason. And I think that's important, that level of self-care too. So thank you, Alex.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thanks to the panelists. And before I ask this question, are there any members of boards of trustees in the room? Wonderful.
Besides the NYCMER board.
Yeah, besides the NYCMER, like say boards of museums. No, okay, wonderful.
Say,
Yeah. Because
There's people with Twitter machines in here, too.
Yeah. I'm glad Tenement has gotten a lot of play here. They're one of the largest employers of museum educators in the city. And they're also not super famous for treating their educators greatly, right? Like a lot of the things that they got was a result of 2 unionization efforts just in the time that I've been in the field, which is in the last 10 years. So I'm curious as to how you think about, I think it came up a little earlier about where power is located. Is it in the staff? Is it in the board? Is it in organizations of staff? Just a little bit thought on hear more of your thoughts about that.
Well, I think with every issue, there are many sides to stories, and a lot of these issues are a lot more complex than maybe what goes around. But I think that everyone is involved in coming up with the right working environment and working with the restraints that exist. I think one of the things that was enlightening in working on the garment issue and garment workers and thinking about how garment unions were structured in the 1980s is that there was a triangle. And there were manufacturers and there were contractors who would give the work to the contractors who would then hire the workers, and there was a union. And so because the manufacturers were part of the union, it was something that it made sense that everyone to be part of the union. In other words, contractors couldn't get work from the manufacturers if they didn't have a union. As far as I know, nothing like that existed with regard to museums, to see how museums could kind of work in a broader structure. And so what I learned in certain situations is that certain changes that would not necessarily have been good for the financial institution. So finances are extremely important, and museums are part of the society and can't change. That said, I don't think it's fair to say that a union means good treatment and not having a union means bad treatment.
Alex, where'd you go? Okay, there you go. So, I didn't work at the tenement, but I feel like I want to respond to this one. Just in thinking about my own definitions of power and understanding that is control of resources, including money, time, definitions of reality. And, not everyone has the same amount of power, nor does every group have the same amount of power or the same type of power within these institutions. So while it's relational, obviously the board has a certain power that the individual worker doesn't necessarily have. I think I'm gonna just say the elephant in the room. I'm from Brooklyn Museum, and there's some stuff going around with Brooklyn Museum. Have you heard? So, here's a really good example around power, right? And who gets to make decisions and who doesn't. But also, I think it's a really good example about how collective power outside the organization can also help to shift conversations, but also shift real action and bring to light other parts of the discussions internally within the institution about labor issues, right? Because decolonization isn't just repatriation. It's about, are the stewards of the museum the same folks who metaphorically are the stewards of the plantation, right? The black and brown people. Are they still on the custodian staff? Are they still doing the security, the maintenance work here? What are those people being paid? What are they not being paid? As far as educators too, whose definitions of knowledge or constructions of knowledge are valued over others? Those that align with the academy, those that align with maybe more real world experience. So I think, I don't have a clean cut answer for you, but I think that we all have the potential, if we can be real and can let go of some of our fears, right? The fears of having the hard conversation about, hey, you make $15 an hour, I make 20, we can't live off of this in New York City, how do we come together? I think there's a lot of potential power in this space, in this room, and in our institutions to really shift certain dynamics that may or may not take, 5 to 10 years or a year, I don't know, but I don't think that we have to rest in not having or rest in lack, A lot of us wouldn't actually be in this room if our ancestors didn't rest in lack, if had rested in lack. So just something to throw out there in this space. Yeah.
Hi. Keeping in tone with sort of both institutional accountability and organizational structure, as well as with dealing with trauma. I also work at an institution that's dealing with a lot of issues. I work at the Natural History Museum, and we had our own Me Too movement before Me Too was a hashtag. And we are literally, Scientific American just posted an article talking about our new curator, who's a female curator replacing the curator who was a sexual assailant, accused of sexual assault at work. And one of the major things that came out of the last couple years wasn't just having a conversation and being able to bring forward these ideas, which I think the other person mentioned about folks having a place to vent their trauma, but having institutional accountability and organizational structure that had a response to it. And we grappled with questions like not only dealing with sexual assault in the workplace, but what happens when a visitor sexually harasses somebody, or when a child comes forward talking about sexual assault and is one of our students and has to be released to their parents later that day. And we didn't have a template for any of those questions, and I get the sense a lot of museums don't. And so speaking to people who are in a position of power, what are the conversations you've had with organizational responsibility, organizational construction? I mean, we had conversations with our HR to develop policies, and we worked with outside consultants to create rules that you go to and point to and say, this is the thing we do when this happens, this is what we do when this happens. Which is missing, and has been missing in every other museum I've worked in. So thinking about that in terms of racism or any of the kinds of traumas we're talking about today, I'm just your experience with organizational structure.
I mean, one thing I'll say, and this doesn't reach the level of harassment, but precisely because when it's not only harassment, but it's just kind of what is it like to be the only woman in a leadership team, and the kind of in dealing with people who are of a generation ahead, and the kind of power that plays out because of gender issues has been huge. And I now work in an institution where there are like 5 executive directors and 1 president, and I'm the only female. So like these are issues that are incredibly important. And I would also say that the biggest issue that educators would come forward with regard to visitors had to do with gender, had to do with an older man on a tour, usually white, who looked down upon the educator or was rude to the educator. So these are very real issues, not just specific harassment, but just the kind of power dynamics that gender is a part of. And I feel like these are conversations that are only beginning now, that other institutions might have had them, but certainly not the institutions that I was a part of. And I think that they're starting now more. I don't know.
It just, when we started the process at the Highline, I felt like at some point I had become the equity police, right? Whenever there was a problem, people will come to me, and then I will be the one just communicating that to sort of the executive level. And it can be really tiring, and sometimes I didn't have all the answers also, and I needed to think of myself and the work that I was doing. And also, then the executive level would come to you with a question, how do we do this? And when you give the answer and they don't like the answer, you're blamed for that. So really quickly I felt, I didn't have the power to create a formal structure. Really quickly I felt that we needed to start creating sort of a group of people that could share, for the time being, that role, and just have also different perspectives of how the organization would deal with issues like this.
Thanks.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Leslie.
Hi. I feel like everyone sort of took care of my question, but I still want to ask it because I still want to say hello to you, to everyone. If money was no option, no issue, what would be like your perfect PD that will be about creating culturally sensitive working place if money was no option.
What was the
Like
Creating a culturally
sensitive.
sensitive working place.
It would be every day. It would be something that happens every day, actually, or at least once a week. It's not one session. But I love that question. And again, I think it's the same, I'll sound like a broken record, but it's the same thing of bringing people together to learn together, that we're museum educators and we're out there teaching all the time, but we have so much to learn from each other. So bringing in the people that would help facilitate those kinds of conversations and doing that once a week, every morning, and having action plans for like what are the steps that come out of it.
In my case, and hopefully money is not going to be an issue, we just apply for a grant that we will learn in a month to do a strategic planning. And my emphasis would be, rather than just in 5 years we want to serve so many people, it's just really take the time to have the conversations about what are our values, who do we want to be, who are our communities, how we want them to feel. So there's no, it's almost giving everybody the benefit of the doubt, right? Just bring everybody at the same level. And then as we move forward, and yes, it's messy and problems are going to happen, we can go back to those conversations to sort of make decisions about that.
I think if money was no object, well, one, we wouldn't even have to worry about grants and showing this need and all this other stuff, right? Because we know the need is there. I think it would look like paying people well, right? First of all, for the work that they do. Because if we're not doing that, then how can we actually say we're going to go serve these people, but like your staff members are literally trying to figure out how to rob Peter to pay Paul to survive, or living, 4 or 5 people in an apartment with strangers that they are uncomfortable with, I think that's a big part of it, is making sure the economic equity is there, like the actual money is there.
There are very few problems that money can't solve.
Yeah, that can solve, right? I think the other part is that being unapologetic about your statements, and then hiring people who feel like they can be unapologetic about their stances. I think so often I go into rooms and I'm like, so what's stopping you from doing this equity work? And everyone raises their hand because they're afraid of getting fired. Because they need their job, they're in tons of debt, student loans. I see your eyes bulging out now. You're like, yes, you're speaking my language. And that's the big thing. And at that point, people are then prioritizing themselves and their self-interest and their survival over the communal or collective survival, right? And that's real. That happens. I get it. You gotta eat first. At the same time, it's cyclical, so it always comes back to you. Right? There's no person who's going to be harmed or oppressed that's not going to eventually snowball into someone else's experience or impact them in some kind of negative way along the way, even if it's just socio-emotional. So that's another part of it. And I think the other piece to that would be hiring community members. I don't like that word because separates community from the public. So often the public is thought to be like folks whose identities fit into the norm or 20th century status quo.
The normal people.
The normal people, whatever that means, and the folks who have not traditionally been othered in the US, right? But hiring folks, those folks who may have been othered in some ways, to be a part of our staff and to work side by side. That actually is a big part of bringing in familiarity. And you don't have to go out and do any of this outreach if people in the communities that you're seeking to engage are already embedded within the conversations inside the organizations and have the power to make decisions within the organizations,
And we should stop talking about equity and stop talking about brown and black. We should start talking about whiteness, and what that means. If not, we're constantly putting, the work on the other, right? We're going to hire all of you. You're going to come and you're going to change our organization, and we're going to continue to do the same that we've been always doing.
And then to keep returning to the bigger question too, not just all of these questions, who we are, but also what that then means when we want to solve problems or build a world with more justice, or to create an American identity that's more, so that we don't get lost in our particular identity group, and that the identity groups become bridges to build something more, so that people can work together.
Yeah.
So before we leave, I actually want to throw out one more question to you. There's a lot happening, and so this is the platform for call to action. So if there's one thing, one issue that we can all look into today, what would be that thing that you want us to really dig deep in concerning making our museums more responsive and engaged in a critical way for this anti-oppressive work?
I would say look at the content of your institutions. What is the content, and what does the content tell you about what you can do? Because you represent your institution when you work for your institution. You obviously represent many other things in your life other than your institution, but in terms of your work, what you're bringing, and what do you and the other questions that you have bring to that content, and how can that combination kind of move you forward with regard to shaping a response that makes sense for your institution, its content and its values and its teaching methods?
Just to repeat what I said earlier, right? Take a moment, and it's going to take more than a moment, but just at least start to sort of check your privilege and understand what your power and your role in the context of the society, this group, your work is. And then please do not take the power of NYCMER for granted, right? This is probably, we can stop talking about our jobs for a minute and really take a minute to define what all these can do together, right? And goes beyond a methodology or content or anything like that. Is, what is the society we want to see in 10, 15, 20 years, and how this group, what's the access we have to build that?